A new composition for this one and call it bounce. Now, let's start off with some text. Now, again, the anchor point is important here because I'm going to be doing a lot of transformation around the point at which this bounces. So where does the anchor point need to be if I'm going to do a bounce animation, for example? Sorry? The bottom. Yeah, so it is at the bottom. I'm also going to center it in the middle of the text as well. Now I'm going to do my movement first. So roughly 1 second I'll pull the text down to the bottom of the screen, right down to the bottom so it sits there against the bottom of the composition. Now again, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be copying and pasting, so all I really need is one bounce to begin with. So I'll go down and then back up again. So instead of moving it back up again, what I'll do is I'll copy and paste the keyframe. So now I have an even downward and upward, albeit linear animation. Now I'm going to play around with the velocity. I'm going to skip the ease because the ease really isn't going to do what I need it to do. I need a very extreme speed when it gets to the bottom because it needs to bounce off the bottom of the screen. So I'll control click on it, open up keyframe velocity. The incoming and outgoing are going to need to be the same because it's a bounce, and I'm going to set them to 5,000. Set the influence to 50 on both incoming and outgoing. Click OK. Just test it to see how it looks. Now I have a bounce, but it's very awkward looking at the start. So I'll change the keyframe or the keyframe velocity on the first keyframe so that the speed is at 0 and the influence is at 50. And I'll see how that looks. Grand at the start, but I need to do the same for this keyframe. Go to the velocity, change the incoming velocity to 0 and the influence to 50. Now I can go back and I can play around with these and use the speed graph in a moment. So my one bounce should start to look better. Okay, now I can open up the graph and I can start playing around with the way that bounce happens through the graph itself. So this is too gradual, so I'm going to need to make it a more sharper incline when the ball is just about to fall. Okay, that'll do for the moment. Again, you can go back and fine-tune this. So I'm going to go back out to my keyframes. I have a bounce. It's okay for the moment. I'll just go back and change that keyframe velocity because I think something might have slipped there. Yeah. Okay, so change that back to 50. Pull that in a little bit. Now, this is the first part. This is the bounce. Now, you'll remember when we talked about animation principles, there's usually a lot more going on than one simple movement. We have things like anticipation, we have follow through, and we have secondary action. I want this bounce text to look like it's made of rubber and that it's actually bouncing like a rubber ball would bounce. And then I want to exaggerate that as much as possible. Now, what you may not expect, but what is actually going to be the case here, is that the ball will stop for a few frames as it hits the bottom of the screen. So this is going to be my exaggeration. It's going to get to the bottom, it's going to stop, and then we're going to anticipate its bounce back up again. All I need to do for that to happen is go nice and close in on the timeline, copy, and paste. So now when it falls, it stops, and you can see that when it stops, we get that sense of anticipation before it bounces back up again. Now I can play around in that space, and I can do other things like scale it and things like that. So I'll do that now. I'm going to go down, it's going to stop, and while it's stopped, I want it to start to compress down because gravity is forcing it down on top of itself. So I'll pull the playhead in there. change the property to scale. Actually, I won't. I'll have my scale and my position visible. I'll keyframe the scale at the same point at which the ball hits the ground and leaves the ground. So it's going to record that size there and there. So now in the center, I can start playing around with the vertical scaling and the horizontal scaling. Now what you should see is a much more kind of cartoony bounce when it all comes together. Okay? Now when I add motion blur, it should look even better again. At this point, because I've got one bounce done and I'm pretty happy with it, all I need to do is to copy and paste all the way along the timeline. Not ideal as it gets to the top, but you get the idea. Okay, so this is something that you can kind of finesse. It looks better at the bottom than it does at the top.